The shocking case of the family that committed the worst kind of incest between parents and children in Chihuahua. For years, the Sierra Alta of Chihuahua kept a secret so dark that not even the wind wanted to sweep it away. That corner, forgotten by all, seemed suspended in time, immune to the passing of decades, where laws, education, and even compassion seemed to have vanished completely. It all began with a routine visit from a team of rural vaccination. One of the volunteers, a young nurse from the north named Andres, strayed from the main road due to a landslide on the road and ended in a secondary path that did not appear anywhere. Modern map. It was then that he accidentally came across a community of more than 8 houses built with rusty sheets and rotten wood. The land was arid, the silence absolute. There were no lampposts, no radios, not even the barking of dogs. Only the raw sound of the wind and a strange feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. A little girl. She looked from the door of one of those huts, barefoot, dressed in a rag that barely covered her body, with the completely matted black hair. When he approached, she didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't say hello. He just watched him with big, motionless eyes. Then, without opening his mouth much, he muttered a word that froze him. "You are my uncle too." It was that phrase that made him understand that something there was not right. And it was also that phrase that led him to discover one of the more disturbing cases than I can remember. My name is Burgo, and this is Forbidden Mexico. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, I invite you to do so right now. Here you won't find common stories, but the secrets that the country has hidden underground, behind closed doors, or in corners where no one wants to look. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare to know what. That others prefer to ignore. Andres couldn't answer anything. To the girl, he just looked at her with his heart beating fast. From the hut he came out, a woman with a dry, wrinkled face who looked to be between 40 and 70 years old. She was impossible to calculate precisely. She told him they didn't need vaccinations or help. She asked him to leave. But after leaving, Andres managed to see something through the crack of a door. An older man sitting on a rotten mattress with his blank stare and open pants. Beside him, a pregnant teenager held a sleeping child who seemed to be over 5 years old. Andres returned to the health center, but he was unable to remove that image of the head. He tried to report it, but neither the municipality nor the DIF knew of the existence of that settlement. He was told that it was probably a closed Mennonite community or a group religious. No one wanted to listen to him. It was then that he sought out Clara, an older retired nurse who had worked for decades in the rural area. He told her everything. She wasn't that surprised by what he said, but because of the place he was talking about. He mentioned that many years ago he had heard rumors of a family that lived beyond the Hill of the Souls, but no official had dared to go so far. They said that there, during the times of the revolution, bandits had taken refuge, and later a couple of cousins who had been expelled from the village for wanting to marry in secret. They went into the mountains and were never heard from again. Clara felt a call. She couldn't stay calm. So a week later, she and Andres. They returned to the place, but this time they were not as health personnel. They were as witnesses. What they found upon arrival was even more disturbing. The same houses, the same silence, but now several people were watching them from behind dirty cloth curtains. As they entered the commune, Nighty, a small child, he ran out and shouted something that neither of them understood. Within seconds, a woman grabbed him by the arm and told him that he wasn't supposed to talk to strangers. Clara approached, raised her hands in a sign of peace, and told him they just wanted to help. The woman, with an expression between fear and resignation, told them that they did not need anyone there, that her family was complete, that everything they had built without the world outside. But before could retreat, another figure emerged from a nearby house. It was a tall man, thin, with a long face and disoriented eyes. He walked slowly, his mouth half open and his arms dangling. He was muttering words that made no sense. Behind him, a young woman, clearly pregnant, was leading him with a rope tied to her wrist. Clara couldn't hold back her tears. What she was seeing wasn't just poverty or abandonment, it was something deeper. It was a community where time had frozen, where family roles were distorted, where children didn't know it was a school, and many didn't even know their names. Of the girls, when asked her age, she replied, "I don't know. My mom tells me that I was born after the last big thunder." They had no papers. They didn't know how to read or write. Some could barely speak clearly and, most alarmingly, they referred to each other with total confusion. A woman said that her husband was also her brother. A young man said that her mother was also her grandmother, and so, piece by piece, Clara and Andres began to put together a puzzle. Impossible. That night, Clara wrote everything down in a notebook. She described every face, every voice, every empty stare. Andres took photographs secretly, although many, they were blurred by the shaking of their hands. They knew they had to come back with proof. They knew that couldn't happen. Stay that way. But they also knew that the horror they had witnessed was just scratching the surface, because that community had its own rules and a buried history that had not yet fully come to light. When he left, the girl Watong. The crucifix appeared again. This time, without saying anything, she just raised her head, her hand, and pointed to the sky. Andrew asked her name. She replied, "Shorty, we don't have a name here, we're just family." And it was then that Clara understood that they weren't facing a simple story of isolation. They were facing a tragedy of generations, a tragedy that began with a forbidden love and ended with a broken, cycled, confused, and completely family line alone. The worst kind of incest is not just physical, it is the one that destroys a person's identity before they learn to speak. He who confuses love with control, blood with property. What they saw in Chihuahua wasn't a common crime, it was a warning. And there's more to tell, because what happened in that mountain range did not end with Clara's visit. In fact, it was just beginning. When Clara and Andres returned to the town, the first thing they did was discreetly contact an old acquaintance of Clara, a retired local journalist named Don Laureano, who for years had documented cases of rural abandonment, secret cults, and disappearances in forgotten areas of Mexico. Reading Clara's notebook, Don Laureano didn't say nothing for a long time, just smoked in silence, and in the end said that he could not publish it, not for fear of the retaliation, but because no one would believe it. He explained that without clear photos, without documents, without backup, institutional, his note would be taken as fantasy or delirium. But he gave them a warning. If they were going to continue investigating, they would have to do so with extreme caution. Such isolated communities are not just victims sometimes, they are also guardians of secrets that they do not want to be removed. He thanked them for their trust, offered them a coffee, and closed the meeting. The notebook with trembling hands. That's when Clara made a decision, and that would change everything. She asked for a leave of absence, temporary as a volunteer in a civil organization that offered medical and psychological assistance in rural areas. With that support, he could return to the place with greater legitimacy, without raised suspicions. Andres, for his part, got hold of a small camera hidden in a shirt button and a pocket recorder. They knew that if they wanted to bring to light what was really happening in that mountain range, they would need more than stories. They needed voices, and those voices, though broken and confused, could still talk. A week later, they left again. This time they arrived with a truck loaded with food, clothes, blankets, notebooks, pencils, and a complete first aid kit. Upon arrival, they were greeted with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Some children approached. They looked at the boxes, touched the pencils as if they were magic objects. The young women, many of them, pregnant, they stood at a distance, watching in silence. The men did not, were coming out of the houses. Clara approached gently, offered cookies, soap, a Bible. The girl with the crucifix appeared again, this time with a slight smile. That lasted barely a second. Clara stroked her hair, and when she asked her name, the girl murmured, "Sometimes They call her Maria, but not always." That phrase was repeated in other mouths. No one had a fixed name. They used interchangeable generic names. Some were. They called Mom and Dad, but also brother or grandfather depending on the day. A woman with hollow eyes said her son was also her nephew. Another young woman with a baby in her arms said her little sister was also her daughter. Clara tried not to show horror, only nodded, listened, and took mental notes. Andres, meanwhile, he tried to record everything discreetly, but what impacted him most were not the words, but the gestures, the way in which that the children hugged each other as if they were husband and wife, the way the adults looked at them without emotion as if they were part of the landscape, and especially the eyes. None of them had that spark of childhood. They were dull, resigned eyes, without horizon. One night, while they were sleeping in the van for safety, Clara woke up with a start. She had heard a scream. As he went out, he saw a woman standing in front of the fire, crying. She said that her son could breathe. Clara ran, grabbed her first aid kit, and entered the shack. There, on a dirty mattress, lay a small child of no more than 5 years old, with pale skin and purple lips. He didn't respond to touch. Clara did everything she could, but it was too late. The child died in her arms. The mother did not cry out. She did not. He threw himself on the ground, just stared in silence, as if he had already been through it, that before. In the corner, an older man was muttering a confused prayer, mixing passages from the Bible with phrases that Clara didn't understand. The most disturbing thing came next. When they asked where they would bury the child, no one knew what to say. Some said they would take him to the hole, others that they would put him next to the others. Clara insisted on accompanying them. It was then that they discovered something terrifying. Behind one of the houses was a ditch covered with dry branches and stones. When they removed them, they found remains of several bodies, all of them children. There were no coffins, no crosses, no names, only small bones, some still wrapped in rags. Clara couldn't take it anymore. She ran out and threw up. Andres caught up with her and told her they had to leave, that they had enough, that they couldn't take any further risks. But she refused. She claimed that if they left now, no one would, nothing, that those lives, those deaths, would be buried forever. He begged him to hold on a little longer, and Andres, although afraid, agreed to stay for a day. More. It was on that day that everything changed. In the afternoon, a young man of about 17 years old, tall, thin, with glassy eyes and a very low voice, he approached Clara and he handed over a crumpled sheet of paper. He couldn't read, but said he had found it in an old box next to a photo. Clara opened it. It was a handwritten letter with ink almost erased. It said, "If anyone finds this, know that we are not monsters. We were just forgotten. My parents were cousins, their parents too. No one came, no one told us. He took us out of here and now we don't know who we are." On the back, a black and white photo. It showed a young couple cuddling a baby. Behind it, a date, 1954. That letter changed everything. Clara understood that what was happening there was not the result of evil, but of abandonment. A chain that began decades ago with an expulsion, with social rejection, with a family that decided to hide, to survive. And with each generation, the line became more blurred. Incest ceased to be a sin. It became a custom, a norm, a necessity, because there was no one else. That night, Clara and Andres decided to do something unthinkable, trying to get one of the girls out of there. They didn't know if they would succeed, but they knew that leaving her would be condemning her. They chose the girl with the crucifix. They called her Maria, but she herself wasn't sure of her name. They asked if she wanted to see another place, learn to read, go to school. She asked what a school was. Clara. He told her it was a place where children could dream. The girl didn't understand, but accepted. Before leaving, they left food, medicines, blankets. They said goodbye to the few who trusted them. And that, at dawn, with their hearts racing, they left the community with the girl in their arms, without looking back. But the road, it wouldn't be easy because there were those who didn't want the girl to leave, because in those mountains what was forbidden was not the incest, but change, and they had defied him. The girl travelled in silence, sitting in the back of the truck, wrapped in an old blanket that Clara had brought especially for her. She didn't speak. She didn't, he asked, showing no fear or enthusiasm, just staring out the window with those big, dark eyes, who didn't seem to register what they were seeing. Andres drove with sweaty hands, looking in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Clara was next to him holding the backpack that contained the letter, the photograph, and a handful of handwritten notes that he hoped to later deliver to the authorities, competent. But deep down, they both knew they weren't entirely sure what they were doing. They had crossed an invisible boundary. They were no longer mere observers, no longer witnesses. Now they had become part of the story. A story too heavy, too tangled to carry alone. When finally they arrived at the nearest town, a humble settlement with a rural clinic and primary school, and looked for an old woman. Clara's friend, Sister Letitia, a nun who ran a small children's shelter. The nun, seeing the little girl, she immediately understood that something was not normal, not because of his clothes or his silence, but because of the way he avoided any human contact. He offered her a glass of milk and a piece of bread. The girl accepted it, but before eating she looked to Clara and whispered, "May I?" As if up to that point, everything had to be approved by someone else. During the following days, they tried to temporarily enroll her in the shelter, but they ran into their first major obstacle. He had no birth certificate, no CURP, no other document. He was, in the eyes of the state, a non-existent one. Clara tried to explain the situation with all the possible prudence, but the bureaucrats listened with deaf ears. They demanded evidence, jobs, names. None of that existed. When they mentioned the letter, the photo and recordings, they were told that they could not take action based on oral accounts or testimonies without legal support, and that in fact removing the minor from that community could constitute a serious offense. The threat was implicit. Andres became enraged. No, I understood how it was possible that someone who tried to rescue a girl from abandonment could be punished and at the same time protected official inaction. Clara, with more experience, calmed him down. She told him that was Mexico, a country where the invisible does not exist until it explodes, where the forbidden is only recognized when it becomes a scandal. He asked them to be patient, to find another way. That's when what happened, unexpected. One afternoon, while the girl was drawing simple figures on a sheet of paper, because she couldn't write or read, but he sensed shapes, he began to hum a melody. It was an old tune, without lyrics, repetitive, with a strange rhythm. Clara asked her where she had heard it. The girl replied, "My mom. I sang it when I cried." Later, Clara repeated that melody to Letitia, who recognized certain chords similar to religious chants from the 1940s used in processions from the north. The connection was tenuous, but it awakened something in the nun. She searched old archives of the local church, and there, among yellowed documents, he found a forgotten file, that of a couple excommunicated in 1953 for attempted consanguineous marriage. Names partially matched what was written in the letter found by the teenager. It was a clue, and at the same time a confirmation. The story that Clara and Andres were putting together was not entirely new. There were precedents, echoes, of something that had already been warned about, but never addressed. Years of omission, decades of neglect. The news began to circulate discreetly among some people in the town, and soon reached to the ears of those who preferred that past to remain buried. One night, Clara received a call, anonymous. A hoarse male voice told her bluntly, "Return the girl." "No. Has any idea what he's doing?" Andres, upon learning this, proposed to take the minor to another state, seek asylum in a congregation or group home more distant, but Clara refused. She said that if were hiding, they would lose all chance of justice, that fear could not win. That same week, a man, he appeared at the entrance of the shelter. He introduced himself as the girl's uncle. He had a false document and claimed he was coming to take her away at the family's request. But when they asked her the girl's full name, she hesitated. The local police were called, but they didn't act. They said they couldn't intervene without a warrant. Clara confronted the man, looking him in the eyes, and told him that if he touched the girl, she herself would report him for kidnapping. The man did not, responded, just walked away with his fists clenched. After that incident, they decided to keep the girl inside the shelter under constant surveillance, but fear had already spread. The girl, he slept badly. He had nightmares. He called Clara Mom and clung to her as if was afraid of being sent back. One day, he asked her if he would have to get married in the new place too. Clara froze. He didn't know what to answer. He just hugged her and said, "No one here is going to force you to do anything." The girl nodded slowly, but there was something broken in her eyes, something that neither time nor love could fully repair. Meanwhile, Andres managed contact a lawyer specializing in children's rights. He showed her the recordings, the photos, the letter. She was shocked. She said the case was extremely serious, but if they didn't proceed, secretly they could lose everything. He suggested filing an appeal under the figure of child protection, with a narrative focused on the omission of the status and the girl's superior right to identity and security. They began to prepare the file, but every step they took, they felt like something invisible was watching them. Some nights they found the gate of the hostel forced. A neighborhood dog was found dead. Threatening messages were written, with charcoal were found on the walls. "Give it back. They don't understand what they're doing. The blood doesn't break. Clara already. I couldn't sleep peacefully." Letitia reinforced the horseshoes, and the girl, still nameless, legal, she started calling herself Luce. She said she had dreamed it, that a man with a white beard told her that she was like a light in the darkness. That name chosen by herself was the one that they used, light, in the lawsuit, because that represented a ray of clarity amidst a thick fog of secrets, of normalized abuses, of generations marked by ignorance. A name that he had no past, but that there would be a possibility. When they finally filed the complaint, it wasn't in Chihuahua, it was in Mexico City, with the support of a national organization. There, the documents were taken seriously. A child psychologist was assigned. Federal intervention was requested, but the story was far from over because, while all this was happening, deep in the mountains, the community where Luce had come from was preparing for something. An older man, considered the leader of that group, gathered the adults together. He said that the girl they had taken was special, that if she spoke, everyone would be in danger, that it was time to close ranks, that no one else should enter, and if they tried, they would not leave. And so, a new chapter began, one where it was no longer just about rescuing a little girl. Now it was a fight to break the silence, to stop the cycle, and to confront those who, for generations, they confused family with confinement, love with possession, and blood with destiny. Electricity File was accepted by the authorities in Mexico City, and for the first time in decades, someone outside that mountain range gave its name to a buried history. The name chosen by her became a symbol and a shield. But although the law began to move slowly in the shadows of Chihuahua, the silence became denser. The community, that tight cluster of rotten wooden houses and empty stairs, I knew I had been exposed. The absence of the girl felt like an open hole, a cold air in the middle of the family confinement. Some of the adults, confused and scared, they began to ask if the world out there would punish them. But the leader, the oldest of all, he repeated that they should not be afraid because that girl did not know anything, that she was contaminated, and that if she returned, would be purified. Meanwhile, in the city, Clara and Andres lived among offices, legal meetings, and sleepless nights. The lawyer assisting them, Patricia, a firm and silent woman, warned them that no matter how solid the case was, the system could shut down. As a trap if they didn't handle each step with caution. There were political and bureaucratic interests and a culture, institutional, that preferred to look the other way when it came to rural areas without votes or cameras. But still, thus they achieved a first victory, the temporary official protection of light assigned under the custody of the congregation led by Letitia, on the condition of following a process of emotional reintegration and adaptation, social. Luce began attending basic classes with other girls from the shelter. At first he didn't speak. He sat silently, observing everything with a mixture of wonder and distance. But little by little he began to draw. His first strokes, they were confused, eyeing concentric circles, faceless figures, inverted crosses without understanding the meaning. Then faces appeared, that of a woman with long hair and a sad expression, that of a man with big eyes with a rope in hand, that of a house with only one window and no door. The assigned child psychologist, a young woman named Mireia, interpreted these drawings as an expression of trauma. But what caught her attention most was the way he was referring to certain people with more than one role. He said that his mother was his sister and that his father was also his grandfather. When Mireia asked if she understood why it was not possible, the girl lowered her head and replied, "It's that there, everything is family." That phrase, said with absolute innocence, marked Mireia deeply, because it was just a genetic confusion. It was the manifestation of a logic deformed by generations where kinship was not built on healthy emotional bonds, but on blind repetition. Luce did not know any other world. For her, the body was an inheritance and an obligation, love, a debt, obedience, a way of being accepted. In parallel, Andres decided to return to Chihuahua, this time without Clara, so as not to expose it further. His plan was to gather new evidence, try to talk to someone within the community, confirm if there were more children at risk. He contacted a documentary photographer specializing in ghost towns and marginalized areas to accompany him with a larger camera. Discreet. Together they headed toward the mountains with updated maps, flashlights, and a camouflaged recorder. But when they arrived, they found a different landscape. Where there had once been paths of land, now there were fallen trees. The houses seemed uninhabited. They heard no voices or footsteps. The place had been hidden even further, as if the earth had wanted to swallow it up. But Andres knew they were there. He felt it. In the shadows, behind the cracks, there were eyes watching. At that moment, they heard a song, a female voice, monotonous, repeating a melody on loop. It was the same one Luce had hummed weeks before. Andres recorded. The photographer took some pictures, but they couldn't get any closer. The air was thick, and fear was growing with every minute. Upon returning, Andres handed the material to Patricia, who began drafting a formal complaint for possible forced disappearance of minors, state negligence, and cover-up, but they needed something more forceful. It was then that luck or fate dealt them an unexpected blow. A registry worker, a civil servant from Chihuahua, upon hearing the case in an informal conversation, confessed that he had received documents years ago, strange, where several births were registered with the same parents, despite the years of difference. Signatures were identical, the names repeated. Everything indicated that someone had falsified documents within the system to maintain a structure of apparent legality. With that piece in the lawyer was able to present the case to a federal court. For the first time, a judge agreed to issue an order to formally investigate the community under the supervision of the National Guard and Human Rights Monitoring. The operation was prepared in secret. It couldn't be leaked. They couldn't warn them because they knew that if they gave them time, they would disappear again. On the day of the operation, Clara didn't sleep. Letitia lit a candle in the shelter chapel. Luz asked to take with her the wooden crucifix she had saved since they met her. Andres, from the sidelines, watched everything in silence. I knew that day would mark a turning point, that it was no longer just a story. It was a battle. The caravan. He slowly climbed the mountain routes with camouflaged official vehicles, trained personnel, and a forensic doctor in case they found remains. It took them almost 8 hours to reach the designated point, but what they found was more devastating than they imagined. The houses were still there, but empty. Inside were dirty quilts, dolls improvised with rags, unwashed dishes. One of the houses had strange symbols marked with charcoal on the walls. In another, they found a fresh grave, recently covered with clothes, still damp children's room. There were no visible bodies, but the smell was unmistakable. The silence was absolute. Andres entered the shack where he had first seen Luz. On the floor, a child's drawing was carved with. Stone showed a figure at the top with rays around it. Below, several small figures embracing each other. At the bottom of the drawing, a misspelled word, Luma. It was as if someone had tried to remember or write his name, but couldn't quite manage it. The operation did not find any people, but it did find evidence, remains of clothing, objects of children, a notebook with repeated names. Everything was documented. Patricia knew that wouldn't be enough. To condemn, but to inconvenience, to force the state to speak out. And that's how it was. Days later, the news began to circulate in smaller media outlets. There was talk of a vanished community of a possible generational incest network of children born without records. Radio programs sensationalized the topic, others ignored it completely. But something changed. For the first time, sometimes the eyes turned towards that mountain range, and Luz, meanwhile, learned to write his name with crooked letters, with patience, with tears. When he managed, showed it to Clara and said, "Now they can't take it away from me, right?" Clara hugged her, told her that, no, that name was his, that story was his too, and that although the past would chase her, now she had something that no one else could decide for her. His voice. But the story isn't over yet. Because even when the truth begins to come out, the ghosts of silence keep looking for ways to return. The echo of the mountains still beat in Clara's chest, even from miles away. Although they were no longer there, although the houses seemed empty and the doors closed, something of that place had remained trapped in everyone who they had stepped on him. Andres felt it in his dreams, where faces and names looked at him from the darkness of the huts, without windows. Luz carried it in her skin in the way she trembled when someone hugged her out of surprise, or when she heard a door slam shut. Clara carried him on her shoulders, on each page of the notebook where she had noticed the details that the world seemed to want to forget. After the operation, the authorities were forced to issue a brief statement. They acknowledged the existence of a community without official records. They pointed to the possibility of negligence in the rural health and education system and promised an internal investigation. But they didn't mention the word incest. They didn't talk about abuse. They didn't acknowledge the horror that had been repeated for generations under their noses among old trees and dusty roads. They just said that action would be taken. Patricia, the lawyer, knew that meant little or nothing, that the burden of supporting the complaint now fell on them. They began to compile testimonies from other social workers, rural teachers, religious and doctors who at some point had heard similar rumors in other parts of the country. Some stories spoke of children who didn't know their age, others of pregnant women who claimed to have never left their house. There were patterns, there were signs, but no one had connected them until then. In the midst of that work, Lou continued her reintegration process. He began attending weekly therapies with Miriella, the psychologist. He learned new words every day. He wrote short sentences. I am light. Light is here. I'm not leaving. Each one was an affirmation, an attempt to assert one's existence after, having been rendered invisible. He also began to question. I wanted to know what a normal family was like. What did the parents do with their children? Why did some girls have birthdays and others not? Because if she had been born, no one had given her a day. One afternoon, during snack time, Luce asked if she could have a candle in her room. Clara asked her, "What for?" And he replied, "To talk to God without him being afraid of me." That phrase disarmed everyone, because in his previous world, God had been a forbidden or manipulated man. Sometimes he was the one who punished, sometimes the one who kept quiet, never the one who listened. Letitia, the sister from the hostel, then began to teach him little prayers. He didn't impose any doctrine. He only spoke to him about a God who embraces, who forgives, who needs no blood or punishment to love. Luce began to sleep better. She no longer had nightmares every night. Sometimes he even laughed. One day he drew a house with many windows. In the center, a figure with short hair surrounded of other smaller ones. They asked him who he was, and he replied, "It's me when have a daughter, but she's going to have her own name. She's not going to use mine." Meanwhile, Patricia's legal team managed to open a formal investigation file at the prosecutor's office of crimes against children. An anthropological expert report was requested to understand the community structure. A new inspection was requested with the accompaniment of international organizations, but they also began the attacks. A local media outlet published a report accusing Clara and Andres of emotional manipulation and exaggeration. They said there was no clear evidence of incest, that it was all the product of a colonialist view of a community. Alternative, it was a disguised but dangerous defense. The note went viral among certain circles that defended the self-determination of closed communities. Radical groups began sending aggressive messages to the shelter. So, many of them talked about child abduction. Others said Clara was seeking fame. Letitia received a written threat. Leave alone what you don't understand. Even Luce began to notice the adult's nervousness. One day, she asked Clara if it was a sin to have left his house. Clara took his hands and told him no, that the only bad thing was forcing someone to stay where she didn't want to be. To protect her, they decided to relocate her. It was transferred to a safer shelter with limited access and surveillance. Mireia continued to accompany her. Clara would visit her every week. Andres would write her letters from time to time that she kept in a cardboard box. She read those letters silently, following the words with her mouth. Finger, as if each line were a bridge to a different world. One day in a session with Miriella, Luce told of a dream. She said she had seen a woman in the forest, dressed in white, he was holding a lit lantern. That woman told him not to turn back, that the road was long, but the light did not, goes out. If one protects her. When Clara heard it, she knew the girl was finding her own language, that darkness was no longer the only voice in her head. However, it wasn't all progress. Patricia received a disturbing notification. The community had filed a formal complaint, claiming that the girl had been kidnapped by outsiders. They used lawyers, fake names, irregular documents, but they managed to open a case. The state now had to demonstrate that temporary custody was legitimate and necessary. This was a new battlefront. The judge in charge asked a special hearing. Clara was summoned. Andres, too. Luz had to testify. Although she had psychological support and legal protection, the mere fact of putting her in front of a courtroom was an enormous symbolic violence. Still, they agreed because they knew that if Luz spoke, everything could change. On the day of the hearing, the hall was full of silence. Luz entered wearing a white dress and holding a crucifix. She walked slowly, without looking around. He sat down in front of the microphone, and when the judge asked him if he wanted to speak, he just said, "Yes, but I don't know how." Then Clara took her hand and said, "Just say what you feel." Luz took a deep breath and, with a trembling voice, he began to tell his story. He didn't use legal terms. He never spoke of incest or abuse. He only said that where he lived before no one had a name, that the nights were long, that sometimes there was no food, that the mothers were also sisters, and that one day someone told her that she could have a different name, which could have light. When he finished, there was such a silence, so deep that it seemed no one was breathing. The judge adjusted his glasses, took notes, and before suspending the session, looked at Luz and said, "Thank you for your courage." Clara left the courtroom with a heavy heart. Andres's eyes were red. Patricia, for the first time, once smiled. They knew that not everything was won, but they also knew that that girl had done what many adults dare not. Name the horror without hate, tell the truth without resentment. But the enemy was still there, silent, hidden, and unwilling to give in, without a fight. The testimony of light was not a simple judicial statement. It was a crack opened in a wall of decades of silence, the words of a girl with no name, no birthday, no past. Official resonated beyond the court. Within days, fragments of the case began to circulate among human rights defenders, independent journalists, and international organizations. Although most of the major media outlets ignored it, but some decided to listen. Small news portals, research blogs, including universities, began requesting access to the file. The story that had been buried in the mountains of Chihuahua was beginning to emerge from the subsoil. The judge, after analyzing the documents, listened to the experts and considered the seriousness of the circumstances, issued a resolution, historical. Luz would remain in protected custody, with psychological, educational, and spiritual assistance, recognized the need to create a new identity framework for her, allowing her to legally adopt the name he had chosen. For the first time, the state recognized not only his existence, but also his right to decide who he was. However, the resolution also revealed a painful truth. No, there were sufficient guarantees to intervene directly in the community without putting potential victims at risk. Inhabitants. Access was complex, the internal structure was hermetic, and the local institutions remained ambiguous and reluctant. The file would remain open, but the actions, specific ones, depended on future tests, on more voices like that of light. And that, for Clara, was like leaving a door half open to the abyss. In the following months, the life of Light gave slow but steady turns. He began attending regular classes. He learned to write complete sentences, to read simple stories. Mireia noticed that she no longer avoided physical contact, that she even sought out hugs. Letitia. She joined small community activities at the shelter, where Luz discovered that she could care for others without, that this would mean losing herself. Andres would visit her from time to time, and she would run to show him her new drawings, her notebooks full of crooked letters, her paper flowers. One night, in a quiet conversation under the porch of the hostel, Luce asked Clara if she could ever return to the mountains, not because she wanted to go back, but because she was afraid of forgetting. Clara replied that memory cannot be erased, but that she is transformed, that she should not bear everything she saw, but should remember it so that it does not happen again. Luce. He nodded slowly, like someone who understands something he cannot say, out loud. It was, so when he wrote his first complete letter, he addressed it to someone who lives where there is no electricity. In it, he does not. He accused. He didn't complain. He only said that there were other ways of living outside, that no one deserves to own another's body, that girls can grow up without fear. She signed her new name with crooked but firm letters, Lou M. Gonzalez. It was not an inherited surname. It was a new one, chosen by her, legally registered, recognized by a country that finally saw her. Meanwhile, Clara and Patricia continued, working in silence. They prepared reports, coordinated support networks, and sought funding for a pilot that would allow the detection of other communities in situations of extreme isolation. Andres, for his part, began to write a chronicle with all the details that he had recorded, without sensationalism, with respect, with true. I knew many wouldn't want to read it, but I also knew that silence is another form of complicity. A year after her departure, Luce lit a candle in an intimate ceremony organized by the shelter. It wasn't a party, it was a ritual of rebirth. There, in front of a simple cross and a white sheet where he had written his story with his, in her own words, Luce said something Clara would never forget. I wasn't born when I came out of my mother. I was born when he asked me what my name was and let me choose. That phrase was later shared on social media by a teacher who attended the event. It unintentionally went viral. Many people quoted her, some cried, others got angry. Some used it for political purposes, but Clara, I knew that phrase was not from anyone. It was from Luce and from all the girls and boys who, they live in corners of the country where no one's voice has yet reached. Today, Luce is 13 years old, dreams of being a teacher. She says she wants to return to the mountains one day, but to stay, just to tell stories, to tell others that there is more paths, that names can change, that blood does not decide the future. The file is still open. There are officials who prefer it to be closed. There are files that disappear, but there are also people who continue searching, asking, pushing doors. This channel is one of those doors. If this story touched you, if you felt anger, sadness, or hope, I invite you to subscribe. Not for me, for them, for those who have not yet been seen, for those who have not yet, they have a name. Here in forbidden Mexico, we don't tell you the news. We tell you the truths that many prefer to ignore. Activate the bell, share this video, leave your comment. And if you believe in something beyond the visible, I ask you to pray. No matter who, no matter how, but pray for the children still waiting to be found. Pray for the girls who never had birthdays. Pray for broken families and for those struggling to rebuild. Because as long as there are those who remember, as long as, whether there is someone who listens or someone who names, the darkness does not win.